So because we have limited time, we will request that the people who are here to not ask the question by voice, but write them in the chat group, and the question will be read to the person who is sharing for today.
Et aujourd'hui, notre thème, comme vous l'avez reçu dans l'invitation, nous parlerons de conflits, nous parlerons de la paix, nous parlerons de résolution du conflit et nous parlerons de conflits sur notre continent et comment comprendre les conflits.
So as you read it on the poster, today's topic will be about conflict, violence, and peace building in Africa.
Alors, notre orateur du jour s'appelle Jonas Wabenda Tshilenga.
Our speaker of today is Jonas Wabenda Tshilenga.
Il est considéré ici en Europe comme un pionnier de l'invention de pratiques de champs, de construction de la paix et de la compréhension du conflit.
So he is known here in Europe as a pioneer in the peace building and peace resolution, conflict resolution.
Et il donne ses cours dans plusieurs institutions en Afrique.
He also gives lectures in many institutions in Africa.
Et il travaille à travers le continent de la promotion de l'alternative compréhension du conflit. Pour dans le but de créer l'harmonie sociale.
So he works on African continent on the topic about promotion of alternative ways of conflict resolution in order to create harmony.
Il est ressortissant d'Oxford Université.
So he is alumni of Oxford University.
Maintenant continue ses recherches avec Huddersfield University.
And now he carries on his studies with Huddersfield University in England.
Et spécialisé dans le pouvoir et les conflits.
And he's specializing in power and conflict resolution.
Donc, nous pouvons dire qu'il écrit aussi les articles dans certains différents journaux.
He also writes papers in many journals on the same topic.
Alors, il est bien sûr ressortissant du continent africain et habitant en Angleterre.
So he comes from Africa, but now he's staying in England.
Il est consulté pour la planification, le processus de planification stratégique.
So he's a consultant in the topic of strategic planification.
Et aussi faire la policy ou la pratique de la croissance de paix.
Also, he's consultant on policy development and peace building.
Dans différentes universités.
In many universities.
Et aussi dans d'autres pays comme Bangladesh ou les autres qui sont consultés à partir de ces pays.
He's also a consultant working with some other countries in Asia, like Bangladesh.
Il joue aussi le rôle de vice-coordinateur de l'OPERAF pour l'Europe.
So he also a deputy coordinator of OPERAF in Europe.
Et c'est lui que nous allons écouter maintenant sur les thèmes que vous avez sur le papier.
So he's our speaker of today on the topic that you have read on the poster.
Alors, tu as la parole, l'orateur.
Jonas, you've got the floor.
Okay. First of all, let me just say thank you for the opportunities, and also I think it's a grace to be given this platform to share just a little that we know, but also to discuss with brothers and sisters from the continent. It's always difficult to hear yourself being presented. So you kind of feel a bit shy hearing about yourself, but it's a good thing. It's a good thing. But the first thing I would like to say about the presentation is that let's not approach this from a perspective of conflict resolution. I personally don't believe in that notion. I think it's an idea that has been promoted by the United Nations, and I am amongst those who are saying that it's like selling ice to the Eskimos, trying to sell ice to the Eskimos. There is no such thing as conflict resolution. Conflict is part of society. It's part of our everyday lived experiences, and we have to develop means and ways to deal with it. So I think Christian mentioned that he was going to project my presentation. I don't see it, so that I could start. Thank you. I'm not so sure if you can see, because I don't see anything.
It is coming.
So, like I said, we have to shift our understanding from a conflict resolution framework to a conflict management. This is very, very important in order for us to build sustainable societies across the continent and also across the world. As you would know, that the African continent is fragmented, and the fragment itself, we are fragmented. Our communities, our countries are divided in terms of its clans, in terms of its tribes, in terms of its ethnic groups, and in other places in terms of its race. So the question is, how can we create harmonious societies, living in those environments and sharing sharing the resources in a fair and equitable way. So, and this is the fundamental question that we have to deal with on the continent. That being said, we have to take into consideration that because we are so diverse, because we are so different, and our differences range from not only men and females, but it starts at individual level. So, as we are different, we will have different values, and we will have different frame of references, which will lead into which will definitely lead into conflict. So today's talk I had entitled it "Understanding Conflict." It's part of a broader module that we do offer, but this is more of a condensed. It's more of a condensed course in order for us to understand what this is all about. Christian, can you go to the next slide, please? So the other modules, when it comes to understanding conflict, we've got armed violence, open conflict prevention. We've got infrastructure for peace. What are the infrastructures that countries can put, or not just countries, even churches, communities can put in place for peace to be sustainable. We've also got architecture, conflict, and violence. This is how architecture itself plays a role in perpetuating and making the conflict. Actually, what is the role of architecture in exacerbating or making the conflict or making people live in peace? So the buildings that we have, what role do they play? For example, in South Africa, if you look at the architecture of South Africa, the country is built in a way to perpetuate conflict, where, for example, neighborhoods are separated, they don't have integrated neighborhood. And this creates a situation where people are in perpetual conflict because they don't interact, and the interests are not shared. And then we have systemic and systematic peace building. So peace itself is, we always work towards peace. It is a utopic idea. is something we work towards, and what are the system and the systematic ways, approaches that we need to, that a country or even a church or a community needs to put in place, or even a family needs to put in place for it to live in peace. And then we look at the early warning signs. What are the early warning signs that we are able to see that will help us detect that we are in the process of conflict? And then we have the strategic conflict analysis. So we can strategically analyze a conflict and so as to identify the players. There are means and technologies, means and strategies that we can put in place so that we can analyze the conflict and then come up with a possible solution to the conflict in order to start the peace building process. And then we've also have the cumulative impact and needs assessment. We've got the policies and proposal for improving peace building and making practice effective and impact. Next slide, please, Christian. Hello? But then for today is conflict, violence, and peace building. Christian, please, next slide. The aims of the talk is to unpack a very complex but neglected dimension of conflict, violence, dimension of conflict and violence having a long-lasting impact on our society. The second point of this talk is to investigate how to challenge it, how to reduce the possible negative impact and to build peace. Next. So when we say conflict, what comes to mind? Can you go back up, please, to conflict? Yes, thank you. When we say conflict, what comes to mind? Generally, when people hear the word conflict, they have a negative feeling. You know, it's more of division, it's threats, it's lack of peace, lack of social harmony, which are fair analysis. And then when we hear violence, people think of war, they think of killings, murder, they think of many of the negative things that can that affect society. And then when we think of peace, we think of the best state that the utopic place where we all want to be, basically heaven. And the idea of heaven is basically drawn from that as well, I think, where it's a peaceful area where there won't be peace, there won't be conflict, and there won't be violence. Next slide, please. So, what is the alternative? In a world where we live now, is that, especially being Africans, we do know that our societies are always in a state of either open conflict or some form of conflict, and then other are in war. So every time for example, when we look at our politics are polarized. You've got to at least take a side in the conflict. So each person identifies with a particular group, whether it could be a tribal group or an ethnic group, it could be a political group, whatever it is. People always are forced to locate themselves within the conflict. And it is, in a way, we are all conditioned to join the conflict from that perspective. And nobody really, few people are able to use rationality to decide where to place themselves. Because at the essence of it is the interest of the group. Right? And for myself, and we saying that it is not wrong to protect the interest of the group, but how we need to now find mechanism in how we can deal with it. We can find mechanism that can create social harmony. So what is the alternative? The alternative is to build a high trust society. There's a book that was written in 1997. I forgot the title. I could give you the title quickly for those who are interested. It's called Social Trust and Human Communities. And that book studied the different communities across the world. And through that book, they were able to identify what are the factors that make certain societies successful. And they're able to control the conflicts that exist within their environment. It's not like they don't have conflict, but even when they do have conflict, they are able to control it. What are these factors? And one of the factors is that these societies are high trust societies. And then societies where conflicts always go overboard are low trust societies. So communities or people don't trust each other in low trust societies. And your word is not enough. So the values that make up those societies and that make low trust societies are that people in those communities do not trust each other. They cannot, the words are not enough. And people in high trust society, the words are enough. So if a person in a high trust society gives you his word, you are sure that they mean what they say. But a person in low trust society, whenever they give you the word, you are not so sure whether it is true or false. And truth and lies are relative, depending on the circumstance. So in those societies, we find that these societies are unable to build infrastructures, societal infrastructure, not buildings, but relationships that necessitate for infrastructures to be put in place so that the society can flourish. So what is the alternative? The alternative is to build that kind of society, and that society is built on an interrelational relationship. It's how you view your neighbor and how your neighbor views you, and how your word or your words, how much value you give to your words, and that is independent of contracts or laws. And laws just come in to reinforce those notions. But at first, it's the values that we have, and they find that individual societies where the individual is held accountable, are a lot more trust. They have more trust amongst themselves than collective societies. So let's find ourselves, where are we in terms of being, I mean, the majority of us here are Africans. Where does Africa lie? Do we lie on the individual, where the individual's word is important, or do we fall within the collective and the individual responsibility is excluded? Therefore, creating a society where there's low level of trust. So can we go to the alternative? So the fundamental question I would ask is, what is conflict like for you? So generally when we do our workshop, we find that when we ask people, what do they think when they think of conflict? It's all the negative things. It's nobody likes to be in conflict, but I'll give you an anecdote. There's a story which goes that Mahatma Gandhi walked in a meeting with Winston Churchill. And in that meeting, when he saw Winston Churchill, he shook his hand, he said, hi, I am in a conflict with you. So in a sense, it's that value to say that conflict we should not consider conflict as a negative. We need to change the way we view it. We should say, okay, I am in a conflict with you. And that starts with yourself, within your home, and within the community, within the nation. Pardon?
Yeah, can you repeat? Qui peut m'aider à faire ça? Il y a eu une coupure là.
Am I going too fast?
Oui.
Sure, I'm going to go slower. Sorry. So I will repeat the story. So Mahatma Gandhi asked
Alors, Gandhi, dans cette rencontre, a demandé.
Okay, so Mahatma Gandhi asked.
So there's just an issue. I think the interpretation room somehow closed. Just give me a second. Let me reopen it.
All right.
Okay.
it all right now?
Okay, please continue.
Okay. So well, the PowerPoint has disappeared.
Just 1 second. Let me put that back up.
Thank you. So, so do you welcome the conflict, or do you push it away? So I'm submitting to you that conflict is a beautiful thing. It's not a negative thing. It's a beautiful thing. So within the church, whenever there is a
conflit est
conflict,
quelque chose de bon. Dans une église, quand il y a conflit,
we should
quel est
accept
votre,
it,
nous
accept
devrions
it,
l'accepter
and deal with it as such.
à
It
l'église.
is a beautiful thing,
Accepter
and
le
it can
conflit tel
allow
qu'il
us
nous
to
vient
move forward.
et traiter avec le
Jonas?
conflit de
So
façon
Jonas, just 1 second. Dido,
telle
we can
qu'il
hear
se
you.
présente à nous. Okay, oh,
We can hear you in the
yeah,
main.
send me back. All right.
Yeah.
Is it all right?
No, just 1 second.
That's it. En attendant, ceux qui parlent français, refaites la procédure pour rentrer dans le groupe d'interprétation en français. Merci.
Okay, bit testing. Jonas?
PowerPoint, please.
Okay. Can you see the presentation?
Yeah. Can you go down to slide 7, please? Or slide 8 is all right.
Is that 7? Can you see it?
Yeah. Can you go to 8, please? F11.
Okay, can continue.
Slide 8, please.
This is slide 8.
No, it's 7. Okay, the next one.
Can you see the screen? Which one?
Okay, maybe I'm seeing a different screen. I'm seeing the one where the one which is written, what is conflict like for you?
Okay, let me share again. Just give me a second. It could be frozen.
Can you go one slide up, please? Thank you. So, in a sense, whenever there is a conflict, you would find that it always starts within the individual. It never starts, out of the individual. So, let me use, and since we are all Christian here, I'll use the example of the church. The person would walk in your church and would not like, for example, the way the music plays or the way the pastor preaches, and comes to his own mind to the conclusion that for example, there was a time this word was being flown around, like, there is no Holy Spirit in this church. So it is in the person's own mind that he is in conflict with himself, or in conflict already with you, or with the church leadership, or whatever it is, but it is within the individual. Then the next step, by the way, this is a model that was developed by the World Health Organization, as they were studying what are the causes of conflict. So you will note that it starts with the individual. Then the next step is the person will contact their relationship. The first relationship they'll contact is probably their wife, if they're married, their closest friends, and then start what we would call a form of rebellion, right? And then from there, they will move into the community, which are a very small group again within the whole social order, within the whole church. And it is only then that the conflict will affect the whole community. But in essence, the conflict started with the individual. So it is always the individual that struggles with something. And his feelings and his thoughts must not be discounted, because there could be genuine concern. The next slide says, can you go to the next slide, please? So in order to deal with it, we need to find out what are the resources, right? Because the first thing is that conflict is about resource. It is never about individual. So, for example, when they tell you that this tribe is fighting this tribe, it's always false. When they tell you there's tribalism, people are fighting for tribalism, it is always false. Racism, it is always false. It doesn't exist. There's always something else that people are fighting for. Identity is always mobilized in order to achieve those goals. So people will fight. People in general will be able to live in peace up until the resources come at play. So, for example, if the resource here is land, then people, for example, in South Africa, the issue will be land. Then people will mobilize identity. They will use identity as a means to control and protect land. But if land was freely available to everybody, or at least land available for people to farm, then people will not. Hello?
Yes, we've been booted out again from the room, Christian. I'm back in the main.
Okay, I don't know why. Just give me a second.
Okay, sure. Sorry about that. Désolé. Équipe française, on va devoir refaire la procédure pour rentrer dans le groupe. Dans la salle en français. Ok. Merci, Christian.
PowerPoint, please. So the resources are key. So the first question you need to ask is, are we fighting for a form of resource? You'd find, for example, I'm going to use the church, as the church is also a basic place where there's a lot of conflict, and we would know. We'd find that a person would come in and might not have a job, for example, but they have the capacity to speak. So they need a way to survive. So the only resource that they might have available for them is the offerings, which will allow them to survive. So it will become the actual reason for their conflict is that they will mobilize the people. They will find a tool within or a contradiction within the community, mobilize people around that contradiction, and then in order for them to access their resource. But also there is unmet needs. So you'd find that people have got needs, and those needs are not met. So the person's got need to pay his rent, need to feed his family, need to send his kids to school, need to, to to have basic bread on the table. People will mobilize conflict because of that. Another one is different values. Remember, values are very important, and generally people would focus on the resources and the needs, but they will never talk about the values. What are the values that links you and I? And I spoke about the earlier book where the author spoke about the fact that the values are what exacerbates low trust societies, where the two individuals do not share values. But in a high trust society, that Karl Marx, in his book, the Communist Manifesto, which is one of the tools which has promoted this study of conflict, because it starts from Marxism. Because Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto speaks about the conflict, the class conflict, and that the different class which have different values. So the one class, which is, I would call the capitalist class, owns the resources, owns the means of production, and they are the ones who dictate the times that people can come to work, the times that people can go home. They dictate when the weekend, when you can have off, when you can't have off. They dictate the prices in the market. Whereas the working class, which make the majority, need the job or need the work from the capitalist class. No, Christian, we're still on the first, on this slide. They need the job in order for them to survive. And the two class compete. They compete. The proletariat, the majority class, the people, they try to access those resources. They try to also get the capitalists to share the resources. The capitalists try to manage the resources so that they can pass it to their children. And the working class worries about the future of their children. So they have different values. The one considers that they have the right to control, the other one considers they have the right to access. And then the different values collide. And we have, protests and all the conflicts that we find in mostly capitalist society, because the two values in terms of understanding what motivates, what drives them collide. Yes, Chris, could you do the next slide, please? However, we need to note that conflict itself can improve lives. If it wasn't for conflict, right? If it wasn't for conflict, many countries would not be free. People had to get into some form of conflict. They had to put their grievances aside. If it wasn't for conflict, in many countries, women would still not get access to schooling, because the women needed to fight for them to get access to schooling. If it wasn't for a conflict or a people that went into conflict, South Africa would not be free, or there wouldn't be the independence movement that swept the continent of Africa. There wouldn't be the human rights movement in the US that gave the voting rights to people of African descent and to women. And I mean, I might even add gay rights. We might not like it, but it is always through conflict that people are able to get what they want. So conflict itself brings.
Apologies. Jonah,
Pardon?
Apologies. It happened again.
Sure.
We have a technical problem. We are back in the main. Sorry. Christian will take care of it. Please resume from the previous slide, please.
Can I go on?
Yep, you can.
Okay. Yes. And conflict can be an opportunity for wonderful growth. I think you've got to look. Still talking about Marxism and all that. Ask yourselves, where does the idea of weekend come from? If you look at the American capitalist system, believed that people needed to work at least 7 days or 6 days in the week, and it was the unions. They started to fight the capitalist system because the capitalist system had a Puritan. The Puritan had a Puritan ideology. The Puritan were a group in America, a Protestant group in America that believed that hard work was the only way, and they made the people work very hard. But the thing was that these people loved to drink beer every day. So they would work well on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Thursday, Friday, they're already tired and they're drunk. And they will come on the weekend, or will come on Friday and Saturday and not perform because they are drunk and they are going through what is it called again? Hangover, their hangover. So the union negotiated through conflict, through strikes with the capitalists to say that yes, people will only have 37 hours working week, which means they work from Monday till Friday at 5. From Friday, they start drinking till Saturday, and then they have Sunday to recover. Then Monday they come fresh. So this was only achieved through conflict, and that very idea was shared across the world. Yes, like I said, next slide, Christian, please. Hello? Yes. Can we move to the next one, please? And as I mentioned, there are 3 keys to dealing with conflict. What is the conflict about? The reason for the conflict. And then you've got to recognize the difficulty. And then you got to speak responsibly, learn a new language. I wrote an article and that article got me a lot of feedback and a lot of discussion. It was in one of the newspapers in Belgium where I discussed the issue of free speech. I believe that people have got the right to absolute free speech. That is because when people are not allowed to speak, whatever they don't say in public, they will say it underground. And they will mobilize underground, and by the time you are aware of it, it might just be too late. Rather know what the person is thinking early, so that you can put precautions, you know. And when I speak to pastors, I tell them that I think the pastorate, for example, pastoral job is one of the most difficult jobs, and I tell them that they have to allow that, because one of if people are not able to come and tell you what they think about you, sometimes if you as an individual, you will find that somebody else will come and mobilize them against you. By the time you realize that, your church is divided, your leadership is questioned and all that. But so you've got to allow people to speak, but you yourself, you got to learn to speak a new language, learn to speak responsibly, meaning the language of saying that right now, like Gandhi said, I am in conflict. Right now, I am in a situation where I have to find a compromise. Christian, next slide, please. So there's the 5 stages of conflict. Remember, there's 2 axes here. There's the rational perspective, which is the y-axis, and then we've got the emotional involvement, which is the x-axis. The conflict always starts at the rational level, because the person who's in conflict always rationalizes whatever the situation is. The individual, remember the World Bank model? So the individual always rationalizes it. There's always a rational element. So even in the home, whenever your wife or your child or somebody's got an issue, in their mind, it is rational. So the second stage is that we don't want the issue to move towards the emotional. Once the incident occurs, then there is misunderstanding, right? And the problem is the misunderstanding leads to tension between the different parties. And if the tension is not handled in a responsible way, we move to a crisis. And the crisis becomes where we can move into an open conflict where there's war, where there is people start to lose their lives, where we move into the violent element of the conflict, and that's where we don't want to reach. We want to stop at the level of the incident, if it occurs, where the conversation can start to happen there. And remember, I said earlier, we need to speak responsibly, learn a new language, so that when the conversation is occurring, we do know. We're trying to avoid a situation of misunderstanding, so that when misunderstanding occurs, the tension it exacerbates the issue. Can you go to the next slide, please? Yes, this is known as the conflict triangle, okay? On the left-hand side, you've got the attitudes and assumptions. So remember I said it always starts from the inside. This is, as you see the red line running in between, these are things that we don't see, right? Where the conflict is at the latent level, right? We've got the racism, sexism, the attitudes, the assumption we've got of other people. For example, stereotype. When people have got stereotypes, for example, they'll say, this tribe of people are like this, this tribe of people are like this. The moment you are into that mode, you are already in a moment creating a possible conflict for this generation or for the future generation. And then these attitudes must be linked to what we found on the right-hand side, which are contradictions. The inequalities, the dispute over land, resources, the dispute over the issue of power. For example, in Africa, most of the conflict revolves around the issue of power, because power is a tool to access resources. So it always starts at that level. And those who are in power promote all the attitudes, the discriminations, the racism, so that they can keep their power, you know, and that is done by promoting also the contradictions. And how is that manifested? It is manifested through behavior. So we see the violence, we see the insurgencies, we see the discrimination act. So now we start to see it in society and how society is developing. So if you have to look at your own society, look at what are if you have to study your society, like what are the attitudes that we have as a people? What are the contradictions that we see in our society? And how are we behaving? You know, how is that manifesting in the way we behave? And then you will see that the more negative attitude you have, the more contradiction you have, the more poor your society is. And the more in conflict it remains. Can you go to the next slide, please? So as you saw in the previous slide, in order to deal with the bad behavior, we need to become a creative people. And in order to deal with the attitudes, we need to have empathy. And in order to deal with contradictions, we need to be more emotive. So the creativity is very important. And how do we deal with a conflict in a creative way? We build structures. You must, for example, we build structures. You'll find that, for example, the role of the parliament plays in a society. What is the role of parliament? Parliament is there primarily for conflict. Parliament is the place of conflict. People go there to fight, to protect interest. It is logical. It is okay for people to have their conflict within parliament instead of having open war. But for a parliament to be effective, for example, just a parliament, we need to be creative. We need to use creativity in order for it to respond to the needs of all the people. And the church and the family can be creative by creating structures or means and ways in order to deal with the conflict that exists within the society. Next slide, please. And then we've got the conflict tree. As you can see, the underlying issues, the root causes of conflict, it's never the individual, it's never the person, it's always corrupt leaders, colonial boundaries, current constituencies, unequal development, the law, the freedom and equity, which means the right, for example, the freedom to speak, how the resources are shared. And then it creates a core problem. For example, land, access to land. And then the effect of it is looting, fear, raiding, unfair representation, hatred, suspicion, and killing. Next slide. And what we don't want, I'm moving towards the end. What we don't want is violence. We actually do not want violence. Because whenever the conflict occurs, then we have a situation of violence. When we say direct violence is when we see things that is happening, people being killed, people being slaughtered and all that. But how do we, people being killed, slaughtered for what they are? We've got three types of violence. We've got direct violence. Can you go down, Christian? Sorry, can you go down? Again, yes. We've got three types of violence. We've got direct violence, we've got the structural violence, and we've got the cultural violence. The direct violence is what we see when people are being killed, when people are being murdered, women are being raped. The structural violence is how society is structured. For example, in Congo, for example, the Kulunas are being taken and brought to different place, and it is a form of structural violence. They are being the society is being violent. Is a violent way that society is handling it. Or for example, in South Africa, where we have demarcation, people of African descent who live in one specific area, people of European descent who live in one specific area. So this is as the society is divided, it is a form of violence. And then we've got the cultural violence, and all these are invisible. For example, the national anthem, the borders. You would find, for example, in the Congo again, where they would say people who are Luba speaking would not go to the Katanga, for example. And there's that conflict of borders and all that, and conflict, tribal, in inverted commas, tribal or cultural conflict. Yet it is more of a cultural violence, and all of that happens at the symbolic level. We talk about symbolic violence. So it is symbols that are used to perpetuate the violence. So there might not be direct violence, but symbols are used to perpetuate the violence, and people get to interiorize those symbols, and eventually it becomes direct, and people get killed. Next slide, please. What we need is so whenever we've got, for example, I'll give this example. In the 1990s, if you know about the conflict that happened in the Katanga, where the Luba speaking people were killed, were kicked out of Katanga, we find that after that, there was never any, there has always been negative peace, right? Negative peace is the absence of violence or fear of violence, but nothing else is done to ensure that we move towards positive peace. Positive peace means that the country or the state becomes creative, develops means and ways to put in place institutions that will allow people to coexist. So when the state does not do that, when there is no infrastructure, we are in a situation where we are in negative peace, and people live together, but they are not. There's always the fear of violence, and that also happens when we look at, for example, talking of Congo again, where we have the issue of Banyamulenge, coming in the country, and are they citizens or not citizens? All these questions, right, are evidence that we are in a negative peace state. There is no violence, but there is no infrastructure put in place to deal with these questions, these issues, which are mostly legitimate, right? Which are mostly legitimate issues that start at a rational level. But because no institution, the state will deal with it mostly through structural violence. Like I mentioned earlier, they will not put in place infrastructure for peace. They'll put infrastructure for violence. So they will use the army, they will use the police, they will use the secret service, which I always think should be reformed in order to achieve their objectives. Next slide, please. The next slide, of course, explains what I've been saying: beliefs, values, right? And then it affects thinking, still at the invisible level, emotions, then the behavior, and then we have a result. So every time there's a conflict or a violence, it comes down to beliefs. What people believe is wrong or right. That is why, for me, for example, when you hear songs which dehumanize, when I hear songs that dehumanize people group, I tend to be like, no, we should not get into that. In Europe, during the past 5 years, we've had what they've known as the migrant crisis, where there was a large influx of refugees from all over the world mostly, but they're mostly from East Africa, which is like Sudan and Eritrea, but Syrians as well. So there were influx. So there was like an influx of them in the land, in the land of the Europeans. And in Britain, the newspapers used to use words which most of us were very concerned, because these words create in the image of the people that the people who are coming in are not human beings. They would call them rats. They would say rats are leaving a sinking ship. They would call them, they would draw them in a way that would dehumanize them. And by dehumanizing the person, by taking away his humanity, it is more likely that the person who will hurt them will not feel guilty. They would feel like, yeah, well, I've just killed the cat. I've just killed a rat, you know? And if you look, whenever there has been a genocide, whenever there has been a killing, all those people were never given the status of human, all the people that were killed, their status was taken away from them. So you'd find, for example, in Nazi Germany, the Jews were not human. When you go to Rwanda, they were called cockroaches. When you go to Congo, they were called Bilulu. When you go to South Africa, they were called Kafirs. Wherever you go, the humanity is taken away from them, and then your people are able to do anything they want. Next slide, please. And I would like to address the myths. Most people think that conflict is between two parties. Never make that mistake. The person in front of you could be the person who is speaking about the conflict. But conflict always involves more than two parties. There's always more people, more influence. We've got a diagram which we call a conflict map, where when you're dealing, trying to understand what's happening in a conflict, you will draw. And by the time you draw, you might find that the conflict involves so many people with so much influence, but they never state that openly to you. But the people involved might know that these people are involved. Second is that people always make the wrong assumption is that the conflict is between good and evil. It never is between good and evil. It's always starts at the rational level. The third is people always think that it's between the right and wrong. I'm right, he's wrong. Never think that. The fourth is the us and them attitude. We need to change. We need to create a value where saying we are in conflict, but it is always us. It's never us and them. It's always us in conflict. The fifth, black and white. You know, it's never black and white. The demonization, right? Generally, we find, for example, in Congo, they will say the problem is Kabila. You know, so you find that you say it's the individual, the problem, or the problem is the ANC. So what is the solution? You know, so when a person says the problem is the ANC, or the problem is the Conservative Party, so what is the solution? Is the solution to kill members of the Conservative Party, right? And that leads us to dehumanization. So we dehumanize the people. And then we take away the humanity, as mentioned earlier. The stereotype, we personify. The problem might be complex, but we will say the problem is the president. We say that he is the problem, or it is the prime minister. They say he is the problem. Whereas the problem might not be those individuals. The problem might be the values that we as a collective share. And we need to address the values that we as a collective share in order to deal with the conflict, you know. And another is the victory mentality. We won, they lost. We defeated them. Finally, we have the right to use violence. And that is a key problem in African politics, in African society, where certain groups, I mean, you would look even in Europe right now, there's a lot of movements of many African countries, Cote d'Ivoire, Congo, Benin, Mali, Nigeria, where they put pressure on their politicians. And these people believe that they have the right for violence. So they are able to beat up their politicians who come over and all that. So they believe that it is correct because they have dehumanized the other individuals. Next slide, please. And the final point is peace building. Peace is the only constant. Peace building is the only constant. The only thing that is constant is peace. And this is what we need to share from father to son, to daughter, to son, and son shares to son. That it is a constant work to build peace. It is an eternal work that each generation must always work in order to have peace in the land or peace in the church. Because if we don't find means and we don't find creative ways to find peace, we will always be in conflict, which will always lead to violence. Next slide, please. Peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the ability to welcome it and deal with the issues affecting it. That's my own quotation. I had to put myself there. But as you can see, peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the ability to welcome it and deal with it, with issues affecting society. So whenever there is a conflict or a situation which destabilizes society, we have to welcome it and deal with it accordingly. Next slide, please. Peace building is about dealing with the issues. Peace building is about dealing with the reasons why people fight in the first place and supporting societies to manage the differences and conflicts without resorting to violence. So we have to move into a peace building mode, all of us, as OPERAF, as individuals, by looking at conflict and trying to find creative ways in order to deal with this conflict in our societies. And I'm nearly concluding. Next is key questions. How do we sustain peace? How do we ensure that peace builders own the peace building process? So as we training people, generally we try to get the people to own the peace building process so they become their own project. So they in a creative way, they develop ways to own the process and accept it as their own. And next slide, please. We've got a model which we call vocab. When dealing with peace, with conflict, the first thing is of vulnerability, which is like you need to put down your armor. Ownership, accept responsibility. And we find that in low trust society, because it is a collective society, you would find that people generally don't accept responsibilities for their own behavior or their own actions. It's always somebody else's fault. And I would say something that might sound a bit controversial. You'd find that people tend to support people who blame others. You find people support people that blame, for example, Europeans for the ills that happened in Africa up to 2021. They would say it's a fault of Europe, fault of America, fault of these people, but nobody takes responsibility and said, hey, hang on a second, it is my responsibility. I need to own up to this. And we need to communicate. Communication is important. Learn, ask, and listen. And we need to accept reality. And what is important are the rules, right? We need to have rules. And these rules, you'd find that in low trust societies, there aren't many rules. And when there are rules, they can be bended and they can be shifted anyhow. And finally, I would say that I dare you to find the roots of your conflict. If you do, you will avoid violence and start the peace-building process. Thank you very much.
Sir, votre micro est fermé. Votre micro était fermé, pasteur.
Ok, oui, oui. C'est ouvert maintenant. Allô?
Allô, pasteur?
Oui, vous pouvez m'écouter?
Oui, oui.
Ok, ok. Merci. Par rapport à l'Est du Congo, j'avais une question concernant le conflit à Beni.
Je peux vous demander, je m'excuse, est-il possible d'écrire? Parce que si nous allons des questions orales, nous aurons à dépasser notre temps, nous voulons respecter le temps. Nous aimerions bien que les questions soient écrites. Ça peut nous permettre de gérer le temps qui nous reste, parce que nous n'aurons que quelques 15 minutes pour les questions et réponses. OK. Y a-t-il déjà quelques questions écrites? Par là, vous pouvez les lire et répondre brièvement.
Oui, il y a des questions dans le chat déjà.
OK. Can you translate it in English and can you read? Yeah, okay.
Sure. Okay. The first question in English: when dealing with deep-rooted conflict, such as racism and tribalism, are there real-world examples where low-trust societies move to a high-trust society?
Yes, there are many examples. Europe is the example of it. Europe itself was fragmented, was divided, and it was a low-trust society. But they had leaders who, or the church played a major role in promoting different values. So a different value was introduced in society. So but this happened 600-700 years ago. You know, it's a thing that happened a long time ago. And all these societies that are successful now, these values were introduced to them many centuries ago. But I must also add that a lot of the time, it is because these societies moved from a collective to an individual society, and that the individual was able to be held accountable. So accountability is key, you know. But Europe is one of the main issue, the main continent or the Western culture. And wherever there are Westerners, you'd find that they have high trust society, and wherever there are people that have adopted Western values, you'd find that they also have high trust societies.
La prochaine question.
Yeah, just to highlight, please put
Out
your
again.
questions in the chat room.
Alors,
Chris, can you reopen
je peux dire quelque chose rapidement?
the French room, please?
Si tu peux écrire, ça nous arrangerait. Par là, nous gérons les temps. Si
Oui,
tu
non,
nous
ça va être rapide.
En tout cas, brièvement, dans une minute.
Oui, je voudrais d'abord remercier notre bien-aimé Jonas pour cette brillante présentation. Alors, tout de suite, nous sommes dans une Afrique qui a évolué dans ce que nous appelons la tradition orale. Et la tradition orale en Afrique était une valeur qui établissait en fait les différentes communautés dans une certaine confiance. Alors, qu'est-ce qui s'est passé dans l'entretemps? Parce qu'en Afrique, la parole donnée, c'est une parole inviolable. Mais aujourd'hui, qu'est-ce qui s'est passé? Est-ce qu'il y a une mutation au niveau de notre valeur, de la tradition orale, qui est, quand je donne ma parole, c'est que c'est une parole donnée.
Allô?
Oui, allô?
Je n'ai pas compris la question.
La
Pouvez-vous
question,
la répéter, s'il vous plaît?
La question, c'est par rapport aux sociétés qui sont au niveau bas de leur valeur, hein? Enfin, en termes de confiance.
Oui.
Avant, en Afrique, nous sommes dans une société à tradition orale. Et
Oui.
quand un Africain te donne sa parole, il y a longtemps, dans la tradition orale, c'est une parole donnée. Mais aujourd'hui, vous êtes en train de dire que les sociétés qui adoptent les valeurs occidentales peuvent facilement transiter, n'est-ce pas, des bas niveaux, n'est-ce pas, de confiance vers un haut niveau de confiance en termes de bâtir une bonne société. Mais aujourd'hui, l'Afrique, je demande qu'est-ce qui s'est passé dans l'entretemps en Afrique pour que la tradition orale, qui était une valeur qui incarnait l'Africain en termes de j'ai donné ma parole et c'est une parole donnée. Et aujourd'hui, si l'Africain donne sa parole, pourquoi on ne peut pas lui faire confiance?
C'est une question peut-être qu'il faudrait que les historiens s'en occupent. Mais je ne sais pas si la parole donnée avait toujours des valeurs dans la communauté africaine. I don't know. Il y a pas. This is what is being said. C'est ce que c'est dit. Mais l'évidence, I don't know. Je ne sais pas s'il y a l'évidence de cela. Parce que il y a eu, si nous voyons le pourquoi, mais il y a eu beaucoup de migration des peuples en Afrique. You know? Si nous voyons, par exemple, la traite négrière, qu'est-ce qui s'est fait que les Africains n'ont pas su s'organiser entre eux? Si nous voyons que tout ça, ce sont des signes du fait que you are unable to organize. You know? So, le groupe ne peut pas s'organiser. Peut-être que l'individu peut donner sa parole, mais est-ce que le groupe est capable de s'organiser? Pour que le groupe s'organise, il faut que everybody must be able to trust each other. And evidence doesn't show that we were able to do that. So, I don't know. Your question is important, but we need to first, your premise is what we need to first question. we need to question whether your premise is correct to say that, yes, Africans have always valued their word. Now, I don't know if that is true. You know, we need to first question that and look at, maybe historians will be able to tell us if that is true.
OK.
C'est à remettre en question parce que quand vous allez au village aujourd'hui avec vos enfants, la première chose que vous allez leur dire, en général dans beaucoup de villages, ne mangez pas chez n'importe qui. Il y a déjà une confiance qui se me crée. Ne mangez pas chez n'importe qui. Parce qu'on va donner la sorcellerie aux enfants. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a déjà l'absence de la confiance des gens qu'on va rencontrer dans le village. C'est-à-dire que nous avons un problème. Aussi longtemps que, là j'enchaîne avec un témoignage ici, je suis logé dans une maison où je n'ai pas rencontré le propriétaire. Je le paye de loin par la carte de crédit et il me donne l'adresse, j'arrive chez lui, je reste. Et je devrais ajouter un jour de plus. Je le téléphone pour lui dire, écoutez, mon séjour termine aujourd'hui, mais là où je devrais aller, je dois aller dans un jour. Qu'est-ce que je peux faire pour te payer un jour de plus? Il me dit, mettez seulement l'argent sur la table et ferme la porte et part. Et j'ai mis l'argent sur la table et je suis parti. Maintenant, je pose la question, comment il ne me connaît pas? Il ne m'a jamais rencontré. Mais si je partais avec son argent, on dit non, non. Ici, on truste la parole de quelqu'un. J'étais étonné parce que je n'ai jamais rencontré ça en Afrique. Il faut rencontrer la personne et payer. Donc, nous avons un effort à faire sur ce point-là. Alors, si nous pouvons écouter des autres questions, et par là, nous pouvons avancer et terminer à temps. Y a-t-il deux autres questions?
Oui. Okay. You spoke about, another question in the chat, you spoke about timeline. How long has it taken or will it take for these changes in trust to come into effect? Historically, has it been 1, 2, 3 generations or even longer?
When the time frame is it always depends on but it's whenever there's a conflict, right? Whenever there's a conflict, it takes 25 years, one generation, for that conflict, for people to start forgetting about the conflict. And here I'm talking about when the conflict is finished. So for example, if you have to take a war and the war concludes and we put a full stop, it takes one generation for the war, for the people to start forgetting about that war. And it takes another, so we're looking at about 45 years for stability to be established in that country, you know? So for things to change, like completely, and the values to be accepted within the nation, I would give it at least 40 years for values to be accepted.
Cela veut dire que nous disons aux Congolais qui veulent créer la guerre maintenant, que si vous créez une guerre maintenant, vous allez tous être enterrés sans qu'il y ait la solution à ces problèmes après la fin de la guerre. Tirez attention quand vous commencez la guerre, parce que vous ne savez pas combien d'années ça va prendre d'abord, puis vous ne savez pas combien d'années le problème reste à résoudre après la fin de la guerre. Tirez attention, vous les leaders congolais, par exemple. Au Tchad, en Centrafrique, tirez attention. Et maintenant au Gabon, tirez attention.
I see a question here. In my country, pardon, you're gone?
I don't know, you can read it from the chat, that's fine.
Yeah, in my country, you hear about manslaughter and mass killing. How can the local citizen end the situation? I mean, first, you need to identify who are doing the killing, who are the players, and this is the key thing. And remember I said that the conflict is never two people. So you cannot say, for example, if you are in the Eastern Congo, you think that the killing is FDLR or Banyamulengo, whatever it is. No, there's always more than two players. The first thing is to identify the key players. Secondly is that people can live together. Every people can live together. It's now to identify values that can bring them together. And the values, the key value is children. Nobody will wants to see children hungry, suffering, or not being educated. So it's a value that people can share, can start discussing, saying, okay, we won't be here in 50 years. but we have children and grandchildren. What can we do so that our conflict ends and they can live in peace? It starts there. But the first thing in every conflict is to identify all the players, is by drawing the conflict map, and that takes a while to identify all the players But remember, in that region, if it's in the east of Congo, for example, we are talking about a violent conflict. So when the conflict becomes violent, we have to develop a new mechanism to handle it, because you are not just dealing with the killing, but you're also dealing with the post-traumatic stress, which has been caused on the community. So whether we like it or not, the community is traumatized by what is happening in the region.
Okay.
Now the last question.
Last question. Okay. See in the chat. So conflicts are inherent to societies. What are the mechanisms that we can use for resolution regarding when we look at Ubuntu? Taking into consideration Ubuntu, I mean.
Yeah, like I said, it's about structure. Society, we need to build structures. What are the structures that we build in societies that can reduce the likelihood of conflict? And each state, each province, each people group must be able to be creative enough to say, okay, we deal with this matter. How can we develop the infrastructure, the social infrastructure that will allow us to live, us now in this generation, to live in peace, and the coming generation in peace. Now, if you find that the same conflict reoccurs, it is because there has not been infrastructure put in place for the management of that conflict. Well, there could be the will to put that. I mean, another aspect I've not mentioned is that you could have the will to put in place the infrastructure, but the people, one group is refusing. So it can take 1 year, it can take 10 years, 20 years, but as long as the infrastructure is not in place, there will always be conflict. But there must be a will for people to put together the infrastructure.
Nous avons la question de Papa Dieudonné Tioyo. Si tu peux le répondre à... Oh oui.
No, I think Rwanda is not, for me, I think Rwanda, it is used as a model, but it is not the ultimate model, because there's one key element which is missing in the Rwandan case, is before I say that, is that Rwanda, if you look at the economic model, it is developing, I mean, we are told, economically, but the social structure itself, the state is built on in a form of violence. The state apparatus is a violent state, and it is violent towards its own citizens, and citizens operate in peace. So what is not being said, operate in fear, I'm sorry, what is not being said in the public realm is being said underground. So the question we need to ask ourselves, because whenever freedom of speech, which is a fundamental right, that it is a God-given right, that should not be taken from people. Whenever it is taken away, people move back into a certain corner, and it is only a matter of time before it explodes. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, Rwanda might seem peaceful today, but is it going to be peaceful in 5 years, in 20 years, in 30 years' time? I mean, that's a key question we need to ask ourselves. Because if they need to be, if they have to find peaceful, then the business model which they use now will have to be perpetuated, you know, for generations to come, like China. But then you will always have lots of Rwandan refugees, just like you got a lot of Chinese refugees. You will always have lots of people killed in Rwanda, Rwandan citizens, just like you've got lots of Chinese citizens are being killed by their own government. And we need to find ways that we can avoid that. And that is by putting it in place infrastructures that will allow the community to speak, to share information truthfully but responsibly, without fear of losing their lives. I hope I answered that.
I think the last two was just the difference between conflict and violence. I think that was I don't know if you answered that.
The difference.
Well. Yeah. Somebody.
Well, violence is yeah. No, violence is, simply put, conflict could be interpreted as a disagreement. You know, the violence is when it is open and infrastructure and people are hurt or destroyed. So basically, there will be the basic differences between the two. I don't know, Kishan, you could guide me there in terms of questions.
Yeah, okay. Then the last one, I think, can negative peace that you mentioned earlier, as the absence of violence or fear of violence, be good for society? Can it lead to some sort of good?
No, negative peace is, for example, when there is a ceasefire, right? It's negative peace. Like, for example, what's happening in Syria, you know, but there is no infrastructure to sustain it. It can be negative for years, like in Colombia, it can be negative for years. But any trigger could just spark it off and people will be hurt again. What we want is to move from negative peace into positive peace, where the infrastructures are in place to sustain peace within the land. Or within the church, or wherever, you know, wherever there is there's disagreement or some form of conflict.
There are more questions, but I don't know if we should continue.
Just the two, we will finish. Can you choose two? Can you take two?
Okay, there's one that says, how do we resolve conflict that is silent or quiet?
How do we resolve conflict? Yeah, but conflicts are generally silent. You mean when, I'm not sure what they mean. You mean silent within the person, or silent as in like it's not open? Generally, when conflict and when the person is in conflict within themselves, there need to be places there need to be infrastructure in place in order for the person to voice themselves, to voice it out, you know. And it's the only way, for me, the only way that you could deal with silent form of conflict is to allow freedom of speech, is to be to the extreme level place of freedom of speech, where people are able to say whatever they have in their mind, you know. It's the only way. Otherwise, the conflict will remain silent, and the leadership will always come up, might just lose out in the long term.
Okay. Can you get the last question? And then I will finish.
That was the last question.
That was the last one. That's very good. Okay. I just say, can you say one word? Political leaders. They are the cause of many open violence. Because many times, if it can be tribal problem or ethnic group conflict, we find behind that there are the political leaders. Ce sont eux qui créent souvent le problème des divisions tribales ou ethniques. Et beaucoup de problèmes ne sont pas créés par les communautés, comme tu l'as dit. Les communautés peuvent vivre ensemble, mais ce sont des hommes politiques appelés politiciens qui viennent créer le problème. Et quelques-uns sont avec nous ici. Ils savent qu'ils sont la cause de beaucoup de conflits que nous avons aujourd'hui sur notre continent.
So
Est-il
as,
moyen de
as,
les
you,
éduquer dans une minute, après nous terminons.
as you said, communities, most of the time they can live together, but conflicts are created by political leaders and they are always among us. So the question to the speaker, is there a way to educate them just in about 1 minute? Speaker?
Hello, I didn't quite catch the question, sorry.
The question is, as you mentioned in your expose, most of the time communities are able to live together, but more often conflicts are created by their political leaders. So the question in a nutshell, do you have a word or what you can teach those political leaders about avoiding conflicts in their communities?
Well, I think, for me, I think it's about the consequences of every conflict. The gain might be any open conflict. Remember, conflict itself is not a negative thing. Any open conflict where there is violence is the problem. So I would say, as a political person, speak your mind, say what you think what you say, but as long as it is for the cause of social harmony, and looking at the consequences of violence, which can take 1 or 2 generations for it to for the consequences of it to be eradicated from society. So I think basically that's all I could say. Nothing much really.
Okay. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup à chacun d'avoir disposé le temps. Nous allons nous retrouver le dernier samedi du mois d'avril et nous demandons à tous les coordinateurs de l'OPERAF, tous les coordinateurs nationaux et les superviseurs que nous avons notre réunion mardi à 18h. Il y aura les changements de temps ici en Angleterre à partir de demain et nous aurons le temps à 18h l'heure de Londres et 19h l'heure de l'Afrique centrale, de l'Afrique de l'Est. Et nous allons nous retrouver mardi 30. Mardi 30, nous avons notre réunion sur Zoom pour discuter de certains points. 2 grands points sont à l'ordre du jour. En tout cas, ayez le bon week-end. Merci d'être là. Merci d'avoir disposé le temps. Invitez d'autres amis pour la réunion prochaine. Nous vous enverrons à temps l'invitation pour que vous puissiez inviter d'autres amis, afin que nous puissions discuter le point de l'Afrique et beaucoup de points. Merci à l'orateur, merci beaucoup pour le programme. Merci à chacun d'avoir disposé le temps. Bon week-end à